I welcome you back to our continuing study in the Gospel of Matthew. We, in this section in our larger study, are looking at the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain, and Jesus and three of the 12 apostles are on the mountain when Jesus is transfigured. Matthew chapter 17 and verse 3, and reading from the New King James Bible. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. The question when we read this verse is to determine why out of all of the Old Testament characters, only these two are chosen to share the stage with Jesus. In other words, is the significance in these two individuals alone? Or is it the case that we should see these two as representatives of something more? In the second sense, we are asking if they function as symbols. The way to determine what the answer is to answer who these two people are. Moses is the one, of course, who led Israel out of Egypt and is the one who brings the law to his people. Elijah is a great prophet whose story starts in chapter 17 of 1 Kings. Elijah is not the first prophet, but in the record appears as the first great prophet. What we then have are two symbols of two key traditions of the Old Testament, the tradition of prophecy and the tradition of the law. They are not one and the same, but of course function together in the telling and story of the Old Testament. So Moses and Elijah clearly are real people who in this chapter serve as a symbolic function. The Old Testament faith pointed to a day when a Messiah would come to his people. In that sense, Jesus is the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. And also, we need to keep in mind that in Jesus, we also have someone who supersedes the law and the prophets. In a sense, what we have on the mountain is the passing on of the baton. Think here of a relay race. One runner, as they run the race, come to that point in place where they take the baton and give it to the next person in the relay race. That is what we see here. That is what is happening here. What the three disciples saw was the lead runner take the baton that day. Now, if you stop and think about it and pull back for a moment, you have to ask one question here. How in the world was it that they actually knew that this was Moses and this was Elijah? Now, I think all of us at some point have been to a social function where they give you a name tag. And on that name tag, of course, you have your name. Now, it could be a group in which you are aware of some of the people in the group, but you may not necessarily know who these people are. You may recognize the names, but not able to put a name with a face. So the name tags provide the opportunity for you to actually put a name to a face. Now, for a moment, realize I'm not saying that Elijah had a name tag on him saying, "Hi, I'm Elijah and I'm here to serve you." That's not what we're talking about. Remember that these two men were men who had been dead for centuries. These were not people for whom they would know that was Moses or that was Elijah simply by looking at their faces. We are told that Jesus was talking with them, and maybe the disciples heard the names. That could be possible, but I think probably the better explanation is to say that after the resurrection of Jesus, we know that Jesus met with his followers. And it's quite possible in some of those times that the three apostles that were there on that mountain with Jesus had an opportunity to discuss this event and get a fuller sense of what had happened. That is maybe when they realized who was on the mountain and who was who. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 18, reading from the New International Version, Peter writes, "We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the mountain." Here is Peter some 30 years after the fact talking of the impact on the mountain. The impact on the mountain was not so much felt at that moment. It was one of those events that could only be understood by perspective. A classic example in most people's life is a wedding. You don't understand the wedding really on the day of. If you're married 50 or 60 years later, you have a perspective to understand what that wedding meant. You know, you look around at your children, your grandchildren, and maybe a few great grandchildren. That event, the wedding, is seen in a whole different perspective by a marriage 50, 60, or more years after the fact. It was after the resurrection that those apostles could see what they saw on the mountain and make sense of what they saw. Here's a principle to understand the Gospels. The Gospels are historical, but the history only makes sense in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The only reason why we still talk of the Gospels today is because Jesus died and was raised from the dead. It is that event that gives meaning and purpose to what preceded. It does not make the events of Jesus' ministry non-historical. No, it allows us to more fully understand what was happening. This is why any attempt to understand the Gospels on a pure historical level is ultimately doomed to failure.